Chapter 5. I fool Pap and get away. The law trial was a slow business, so every now and then I would borrow $2 or $3 from Judge Thatcher and give it to Pap to keep him from getting a thrashing. Every time I let him have money, he got drunk, and every time he got drunk, he raised Cain around town and got jailed. This just suited him fine. He kept hanging around the widow's house where I lived until she told him if he didn't stay away, she would make trouble for him. Well, wasn't he mad? He said it'd show who was Huck Finn's boss, so he watched out for me one day in the spring and caught me and took me up the river about 3 miles in a boat. We crossed over to the Illinois shore where there was an old log hut in a place where the timber was so thick you couldn't find it if you didn't know where it was. We lived in that old cabin and fished and hunted for a living. Every few days he locked me in and went to the store at the ferry 3 miles below. At the store he traded his fish and game for whiskey and then got drunk and licked me. The widow found out where I was by and by, and she sent a man over to try and get a hold of me, but Pap drove him off with a gun. 2 months or more went along. I got used to the place and liked it, all but the thrashing part. It was kind of lazy and jolly to fish and hunt all day, no books nor study. I didn't have to wash and comb up, nor go to bed and get up regular, nor eat on a plate and have old Miss Watson pecking at me all the time. I got so I didn't want to go back. It was pretty good times in the woods. But by and by, Pap got too handy with his hickory. I was all over welts. He got to going away so much, too, and leaving me locked in. Once he locked me in and was gone 3 days. I was scared. I made up my mind I would fix up some way to leave there. There wasn't a window big enough for a dog to get through. The door was thick, solid oak slabs. I found an old rusty wood saw stuck in between a rafter and the roof. One day when Pap was away, I greased it and got it ready for use. An old horse blanket was nailed against the logs at the far end of the cabin behind the table. This was to keep the wind from blowing through the chinks and putting the candle out. I got under the table and raised the blanket and went to work to saw a hole through the big bottom log. It was a good long job, but I was getting toward the end of it when I heard Pap's gun in the woods. I dropped the blanket and hid my saw. Pretty soon Pap opened the door. He wasn't in a good humor, so he was in his natural self. He said he had been downtown and everything there was going wrong. His lawyer had said he could win the lawsuit and get the money if they ever got started on the trial, but Judge Thatcher would know how to keep putting it off. And he said people thought there'd be another trial to get me away from Pap and give me to the widow, and they guessed it would win this time. This news shook me up. I didn't want to go back to the widow's and live so civilized, as they called it. Then the old man got to cussing. He cussed everybody he could think of, and then cussed them all over again to make sure he didn't skip any. He said he'd like to see the widow get me. He said there was a place 6 or 7 miles off that he could stow me in, and they might hunt till they dropped and they couldn't find me. That made me pretty uneasy again. I wouldn't stay on hand till he got that chance. The old man made me go to the skiff and bring in the things he had brought. There was a 50-pound sack of cornmeal and side of bacon, ammunition, and a 4-gallon jug of whiskey. I toted all the things up to the cabin. The old man took a swig or two and went to ripping again. Whenever his liquor had begun to work, he always went for the government. This time, he says, "Call this a government? Here's the law standing, ready to take a man's son away from him. Yes, just as I have got him raised and ready to go to work for me and give me a rest. The law takes a man like me, worth $6,000, and jams him into an old cabin like this and lets him go round in clothes not fit for a hog. They call the government. Sometimes I've a mighty notion to leave the country for good and all. Yes, and I told old Thatcher so to his face. Lots of people heard me. I said for 2 cents I would leave the blamed country and never come near it again. Oh yes, this is a wonderful government, wonderful. Why, looky here. There was a freight there from Ohio, almost as white as a white man, and there ain't a man in town that has got as fine clothes as he had, a gold watch and chain and a silver-headed cane. And what do you think? They said he was a professor in college and could talk all kinds of languages. And that ain't the worst. They said he could vote when he was at home. Right then I says, I'll never vote again. They all heard me and the country may rot for all me. I'll never vote again as long as I live. Pap was a-going on, so he never noticed where his old limber legs took him. So he went head over heels over the tub of salt pork and barked both his shins. The rest of his speech was the hottest kind of language. He hopped around the cabin, first on one leg and then on the other, holding his fist one shin and then the other. Then he let out with his left foot all of a sudden and gives the tub a rattling kick. But that was the boot that had a couple of toes leaking out the front end of it. He raised a howl and down he went and rolled there and held his toes. And the cussing was hotter than any he had ever done before. Well, don't stand there all day, Pap said. Out with you and see if you find any fish in the lines. I'll be along in a minute. I cleared out up the riverbank. I noticed some tree limbs floating down and a sprinkling of bark. The river is beginning to come up. I could have a great time now over at the town. With the June rise, cordwood would come flowing down in pieces of log rafts, sometimes a dozen logs together. All you had to do was to catch them and sell them to the wood yards and the sawmills. I went along up the bank with one eye out for Pap and the other out for what the river might bring along. Well, all at once, here comes a canoe, a beauty, about 15 feet long, riding high like a duck. I shot head first off the bank like a frog and struck out for the canoe. I climbed in and paddled her ashore. I just hired her, and when I was ready to run away, instead of taking to the woods, I would go down the river. I rowed her into a little creek all hung out with vines and willows and left her there. Pretty soon, Pap comes out, and we go along the bank looking at the river. It was coming up pretty fast, with lots of driftwood going down. By and by along comes part of a log raft, 9 logs fast together. We went out with the skiff and towed it ashore. Right away, he must shove right over to St. Petersburg and sell. So he locked me in and took the boat and started off towing the raft. Then I out with my saw and went to work on that log again. Before he was on the other side of the river, I was out of the hole. I took some cornmeal and bacon and coffee and sugar and put it in the canoe. Then I took 2 blankets, the skillet, and the coffee pot. I took fish lines and matches and candles and other things, everything that was worth a cent. I cleaned out the place. I wore the ground a good deal, crawling through and dragging out so many things, but I scattered dust over the ground and put the piece of log back in its place. If you stood a few feet away, you wouldn't even notice a thing. It was all grass clear to the canoe, so I hadn't left a track. Then I got the gun and went up a piece into the woods and shot a wild pig. I took this fellow back to the cabin and smashed the door in with the axe. Then I took the pig inside, hacked his throat with the axe, and laid him down to bleed. Well, next I took an old sack and put a lot of big rocks in it, all I could drag, and started it from the pig and dragged it down to the river. You could see plain enough that something had been dragged over the ground. I dumped it in the river, and down it went, out of sight. Lastly, I pulled out some of my hair, stuck it on the bloody axe, and slung the axe into the corner. Then I took up the pig and held him so he wouldn't drip till I got a good piece below the house, and then dumped him in. All right, I thought, now they will think my dead body's in the river. I can stop anywhere. Jackson's Island is good enough for me. I know that island pretty well, and nobody ever goes there. Then I can paddle over to town nights and slink around and pick up things I want. Jackson's Island is the place. I went to the canoe. It was night now, but the moon was so bright I could count the drift logs that went slipping along black and still. The river looked miles and miles across. I went spinning down the stream in the shade of the bank for about 2 miles. Then I struck out toward the middle of the river. Pretty soon I would be passing the ferry landing, and people might see me and hail me. I could hear people talking at the ferry landing. Then the talk got further and further off, so I went on below the ferry. About 2 miles downstream, there was Jackson's Island, standing in the middle of the river, big and dark and solid. It didn't take me long to get there. I shot past the head at the ripping rate. The current was so swift. Then I got into the dead water and landed on the side toward the Illinois shore. I parted the willows and pushed the canoe into a deep dent in the bank. Then I landed and made fast the canoe. First, I went up to the head of the island and looked out on the big river. 3 or 4 lights winked over in St. Petersburg, 2 or 3 miles away. Then I went into the woods and stretched out for a nap before breakfast.